The Bell and Crown pub had seen better days, but Marcus Thompson wasn't about to let anyone disrespect his establishment. The old Victorian building sat on the corner of Wellington Street, its weathered brick facade telling stories of countless nights filled with laughter, arguments, and the occasional brawl. Marcus had owned the pub for 12 years, taking it over from his father who had run it for 30 years before him. It was more than a business to him. It was his legacy, his pride, and his responsibility. On that particular Tuesday evening in November, the autumn rain hammered against the windows while a modest crowd of regulars nursed their pints. The atmosphere was warm and comfortable, filled with the familiar sounds of quiet conversation and the occasional clink of glasses. Mrs. Henderson from down the street sat in her usual corner booth, working on her crossword puzzle while sipping her weekly sherry. Old Tom and his mates occupied their traditional spot near the fireplace, arguing about football as they had done every Tuesday for the past decade. The trouble began when Guardsman James Mitchell walked through the heavy wooden doors just after 8 o'clock. He wore his pristine red tunic with its gleaming brass buttons, the iconic black bearskin tucked under his arm, and polished black boots that reflected the pub's dim lighting. At 23 years old, James carried himself with the rigid posture that military training had drilled into him. He had just finished his shift at Buckingham Palace and desperately needed a drink to wash away the stress of an unusually difficult day. Marcus noticed the young soldier immediately. Something about uniformed military personnel in his pub always made him uncomfortable, though he couldn't quite explain why. Perhaps it was the memories of his younger brother Danny, who had died in Afghanistan 8 years earlier. Or maybe it was the way some soldiers acted like they owned the place, just because they wore a uniform. Whatever the reason, Marcus felt his jaw tighten as he watched James approach the bar. James ordered a pint of bitter and found himself a quiet table near the back of the pub. He had no intention of causing trouble. In fact, he rarely spoke when he was out of uniform, preferring to keep to himself after long days of standing perfectly still while tourists photographed him and children pointed. The weight of representing the crown every single day was exhausting, and all he wanted was 30 minutes of anonymity with a cold beer. However, anonymity was impossible in his ceremonial uniform. Within minutes, other patrons began staring and whispering. Some pulled out their phones to take pictures, while others made comments just loud enough for him to hear. James tried to ignore it all, focusing on his drink and trying to relax his aching shoulders. The situation escalated when a group of university students noticed him. They had been drinking for hours, celebrating the end of their exams, and their judgment was severely impaired. One of them, a lanky young man named Chris, decided it would be hilarious to approach the guardsman and mock the way he stood at attention. Chris began marching around James's table in an exaggerated military style, shouting fake orders and making ridiculous saluting gestures. His friends found it amusing, but James felt his face burning with embarrassment and anger. He had endured similar mockery before, but never in a place where he had hoped to find some peace. He stood up slowly, his training keeping his movements controlled despite the fury building inside him. Marcus watched the scene unfold from behind the bar, his irritation growing. He didn't like disruptions in his pub, and he certainly didn't like seeing his regular customers uncomfortable. But instead of addressing the drunk students who were actually causing the problem, he found himself angry at the guardsman for bringing this attention into his establishment. When James finally had enough and told Chris to leave him alone, his voice carried the authoritative tone he used when dealing with unruly tourists at the palace. It was firm, clear, and commanding, exactly the way he had been trained to speak when representing the crown. Marcus heard that tone and something snapped inside him. All his grief, frustration, and buried anger came rushing to the surface. He saw James not as a young man trying to enjoy a quiet drink after work, but as a symbol of everything he resented about authority and military pride. Storming over to the table, Marcus grabbed James by the arm and began shouting about how he wouldn't tolerate anyone acting high and mighty in his pub. James tried to explain that he was just defending himself against the harassment, but Marcus wasn't listening. His voice grew louder, drawing the attention of every person in the establishment. The other patrons watched in stunned silence as Marcus accused James of thinking he was better than everyone else, just because he wore a fancy uniform. He ranted, about soldiers who thought they could walk into any place and demand respect, completely ignoring the fact that James had been sitting quietly by himself until he was provoked. James remained as calm as possible, his military discipline preventing him from responding with the same level of aggression. He tried to reason with Marcus, explaining that he had only raised his voice to stop the harassment from the drunk students. But his measured responses only seemed to infuriate the pub owner more. The confrontation reached its peak when Marcus grabbed James's bearskin hat from the table and threw it toward the door. The sacred piece of military regalia hit the floor with a dull thud, and the entire pub fell silent. Even the drunk students stopped their laughing, sensing that something serious had just happened. James looked down at his ceremonial hat lying on the dirty pub floor, then back at Marcus with a mixture of hurt and disbelief. Without saying another word, he picked up his bearskin, straightened his uniform, and walked toward the door. The silence followed him all the way outside, where the cold November rain immediately began soaking through his wool tunic. As the heavy door closed behind the young guardsman, Marcus felt a momentary twinge of regret. But his pride and anger quickly pushed those feelings aside. He had made his point about who was in charge of the bell and crown, and he wasn't about to apologize for it now. James Mitchell walked through the rain-soaked streets, his wet uniform clinging to his body and his pride thoroughly shattered. The ceremonial red tunic that usually commanded respect and admiration now felt like a target painted on his back. Every step echoed with the memory of his bearskin hitting the pub floor and the humiliating laughter that had followed. By the time he reached the guards' barracks at Wellington Barracks, word of the incident had already begun to spread. The military community was smaller and more tightly connected than most people realized, especially among the units responsible for ceremonial duties. James's squad mate, Corporal David Hayes, was waiting for him in the common room, having heard whispers about some kind of trouble at a local pub. David had served with James for 2 years and had never seen his friend look so defeated. James was usually one of the most composed guardsmen in their unit, someone who took pride in representing the crown and rarely let civilian attitudes affect him. But tonight, something had clearly broken through his professional armor. James recounted the entire evening, from the moment he entered the Bell and Crown seeking a quiet drink to the humiliating ejection that followed. He spoke slowly and carefully, his voice barely above a whisper as he described how the pub owner had grabbed his bearskin and thrown it toward the door like it was garbage. David listened with growing anger. Like most guardsmen, he understood the sacred nature of their ceremonial uniform and equipment. The bearskin wasn't just a hat. It was a symbol of centuries of military tradition, honor, and service to the crown. For a civilian to handle it with such disrespect was more than just an insult to James. It was an insult to every guardsman who had ever worn the uniform. Within hours, the story had spread throughout the entire Guards regiment. Each telling added new details and increased the sense of outrage among the soldiers. Some versions claimed that Marcus had not only thrown the bearskin, but had also used profanity and made disparaging comments about the military. Others suggested that James had been physically assaulted, or that other patrons had joined in the harassment. By morning, nearly every guardsman stationed in London had heard some version of the tale. The story reached the ears of Sergeant Major William Crawford, a 30-year veteran who had seen combat in 3 different conflicts and had little patience for civilians who disrespected his soldiers. Crawford was exactly the kind of leader who took personal responsibility for the welfare and dignity of every man under his command. Crawford called James into his office first thing Wednesday morning. Unlike the angry mob of guardsmen who wanted immediate retribution, the sergeant major approached the situation with military precision and professionalism. He listened to James's account without interruption, asking pointed questions about the timeline of events and the specific actions of the pub owner. After hearing the full story, Crawford made a decision that would change everything. He wasn't interested in starting a fight or seeking revenge, but he also couldn't allow such blatant disrespect for the uniform to go unaddressed. The Guards had a reputation to maintain, and part of that reputation was built on the understanding that they would always stand together when one of their own was wronged. Meanwhile, Marcus Thompson was dealing with his own problems at the Bell and Crown. Word of the previous night's incident had spread through his regular customer base, and opinions were sharply divided. Some of his longtime patrons supported his decision, claiming that soldiers needed to learn they weren't special just because they wore fancy uniforms. But others, particularly the older customers who remembered when military service was more universally respected, were appalled by his behavior. Mrs. Henderson, who had witnessed the entire confrontation from her corner booth, was particularly vocal about her disapproval. She had lost her own son in the Falklands War, and viewed the ceremonial guards as living memorials to all the young men who had died in service to their country. The idea that Marcus had humiliated one of these soldiers in such a public manner made her physically ill. The local community was also beginning to take sides. The Bell and Crown had been a fixture in the neighborhood for over 60 years, and many residents had strong emotional connections to the pub. But the story of what had happened was spreading beyond just the regular customers, reaching people who had never set foot in the establishment but had strong opinions about how military personnel should be treated. Social media began picking up the story, though the details remained confused and contradictory. Some posts painted James as an arrogant soldier who had gotten what he deserved, while others portrayed him as a victim of anti-military prejudice. The hashtag #RespectTheGuard began trending in certain circles, while counterposts argued that soldiers didn't deserve special treatment just because of their uniforms. Back at the barracks, Sergeant Major Crawford was developing his response plan. He had spent Wednesday morning making phone calls and consulting with his superiors about the appropriate course of action. The military had protocols for dealing with civilian complaints against soldiers, but there were fewer guidelines for handling situations where civilians had clearly wronged military personnel. Crawford's plan was elegant in its simplicity. He wouldn't file formal complaints or seek legal action against Marcus Thompson. He wouldn't organize protests or encourage his men to post angry messages on social media. Instead, he would demonstrate the power of military unity and brotherhood in the most peaceful but unmistakable way possible. Thursday morning brought crisp autumn air and clear skies to London. Crawford gathered his men in the barracks courtyard and explained his decision. They would visit the Bell and Crown as a unit, in full dress uniform, to show their support for James and to demonstrate that an insult to one guardsman was an insult to all of them. The plan wasn't about intimidation or revenge. It was about dignity, respect, and the bonds that held the military community together. Crawford made it clear that there would be no confrontation, no raised voices, and no threatening behavior. They would simply appear, make their presence known, and allow Marcus Thompson to understand the full implications of his actions. As word of the planned visit spread through the Guards Regiment, volunteers began stepping forward. Men from different companies and even different regiments asked permission to join the group heading to the Bell and Crown. What had started as a simple show of support was growing into something much larger and more significant. Thursday afternoon brought an unexpected visitor to the Bell and Crown. Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield, a distinguished woman in her 70s, pushed through the heavy wooden doors with the determined stride of someone on a mission. She had been a military wife for 45 years before her husband's death, and the story of what had happened to young Guardsman Mitchell had reached her through the extensive network of military families in London. Marcus looked up from behind the bar where he was restocking glasses, immediately recognizing the type of customer who could either make or break his afternoon. Mrs. Whitfield had the bearing of someone accustomed to being listened to, and her sharp blue eyes surveyed the pub with the critical gaze of someone who had managed military households and social functions for decades. She ordered a cup of tea and settled herself at the bar, engaging Marcus in what seemed like casual conversation about the weather and the neighborhood. But Marcus could sense there was more to her visit than a simple desire for afternoon tea. His instincts proved correct when she finally brought up the incident from Tuesday night. Mrs. Whitfield didn't raise her voice or make accusations. Instead, she spoke quietly about what it meant to wear the uniform of the Queen's Guard, about the young men who dedicated their lives to serving something larger than themselves, and about the weight of tradition that each guardsman carried on his shoulders. She described the rigorous training these soldiers underwent, not just in military skills but in self-discipline and public service. Her words cut deeper than any angry confrontation could have. She painted a picture of James Mitchell that Marcus had never considered, a young man who stood motionless for hours in all weather, enduring harassment from tourists and drunks while maintaining perfect composure, all for the sake of upholding centuries of British tradition. Marcus found himself listening more carefully than he had expected. Mrs. Whitfield's calm, measured tone and obvious knowledge of military life made him reconsider his actions from Tuesday night. For the first time since the incident, he began to wonder if he had been too hasty in his judgment of the young guardsman. But before Marcus could fully process these new perspectives, Mrs. Whitfield delivered the information that would change everything. She mentioned almost casually that she had heard through military channels that Sergeant Major Crawford was planning to visit the pub with some of his men. She didn't know exactly when or how many soldiers would be coming, but she wanted to give Marcus fair warning about what was approaching. The blood drained from Marcus's face as the implications hit him. He had expected the incident to blow over after a day or two, like most pub conflicts did. The idea that an entire military unit was planning to visit his establishment sent a chill down his spine. His mind immediately jumped to worst-case scenarios: angry soldiers causing trouble, potential violence, police involvement, and damage to his business reputation. Mrs. Whitfield seemed to read his thoughts. She assured him that Sergeant Major Crawford was a professional soldier who wouldn't tolerate any inappropriate behavior from his men. But she also made it clear that the visit wasn't going to be a casual social call. The guards were coming to make a point, and that point was about respect, dignity, and the consequences of humiliating one of their own. After Mrs. Whitfield left, Marcus spent the rest of Thursday afternoon in a state of anxious anticipation. He couldn't concentrate on his usual tasks, finding himself constantly checking the windows for any sign of approaching soldiers. Every time the door opened, he expected to see red tunics and tall black hats flooding into his pub. The regular customers who came in for their afternoon pints noticed his distracted behavior immediately. Marcus was usually chatty and engaging, someone who remembered everyone's preferred drink and asked about their families and jobs. But today, he seemed distant and worried, giving short answers and frequently glancing toward the entrance. Old Tom, one of Marcus's most loyal customers, finally asked what was bothering him. Marcus found himself telling the whole story, from Tuesday night's incident to Mrs. Whitfield's warning about the impending military visit. The reaction from his regulars was mixed and intense. Some customers were angry that Marcus was being intimidated by what they saw as military bullying. They argued that he had every right to eject anyone from his pub, regardless of what uniform they wore. These supporters urged him to call the police if the soldiers showed up, claiming that a group of military personnel entering a civilian establishment could be seen as threatening behavior. But other customers, particularly those with military connections or family members who had served, were more critical of Marcus's original actions. They pointed out that the young guardsman hadn't actually done anything wrong and had been trying to defend himself against harassment from drunk university students. These voices suggested that Marcus owed the soldier an apology and should be prepared to make things right when the military delegation arrived. The division among his customer base was something Marcus had never experienced before. The Bell and Crown had always been a place where disagreements were settled over pints and everyone went home as friends. But this incident had opened up deeper divisions about respect for military service, civilian rights, and the appropriate way to handle conflicts. As Thursday evening approached, Marcus made a decision that surprised even himself. Instead of closing the pub early or calling for police support, he decided to stay open and face whatever was coming. Part of him was genuinely curious about what form this military visit would take, and another part felt obligated to his regular customers who wanted to see how the situation would unfold. The evening crowd was larger than usual, as word of the impending military visit had spread throughout the neighborhood. Some people came hoping to witness drama, while others arrived to show support for either Marcus or the military, depending on their personal views. The atmosphere was tense but not hostile, filled with the kind of anticipatory energy that precedes significant events. Marcus tried to maintain his normal routine, serving drinks and making conversation, but everyone could see that he was on edge. He kept checking his watch and looking toward the door, wondering when the soldiers would arrive and what exactly they intended to do when they got there. At 9 o'clock, Mrs. Henderson arrived for what she said might be her last visit to the Bell and Crown. She had been coming to the pub for 15 years, ever since her husband died, and it had become her primary social outlet. But she made it clear that she couldn't continue to support an establishment where military personnel were treated with disrespect. Her quiet dignity and obvious disappointment affected Marcus more than any angry confrontation could have. Mrs. Henderson wasn't dramatic or accusatory. She was simply sad that a place she had loved was no longer somewhere she felt comfortable spending her time. As the evening wore on and no soldiers appeared, some customers began to wonder if the whole thing had been exaggerated, or if the military visit was just a rumor. But Marcus knew better. Military operations were planned carefully and executed precisely. If Sergeant Major Crawford had decided to visit the Bell and Crown, he would arrive exactly when he intended to arrive, and the impact would be exactly what he intended it to be. Friday morning dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of autumn sunlight that made London's old buildings glow like golden monuments. At Wellington Barracks, Sergeant Major William Crawford stood before 43 guardsmen who had volunteered to join what had become known simply as the visit to the Bell and Crown pub. The assembled soldiers represented nearly every unit of the Guards Division stationed in London. There were men from the Grenadier Guards, the Coldstream Guards, the Scots Guards, the Irish Guards, and the Welsh Guards. Some had decades of experience, while others were barely out of training. But they all shared one common purpose: to demonstrate that an attack on one guardsman was an attack on the entire Brotherhood. Crawford had spent the previous evening reviewing his plan with his officers, ensuring that every detail had been considered. This wasn't a spontaneous act of military anger. It was a carefully orchestrated demonstration of unity and discipline. Each guardsman knew exactly what was expected of him, and Crawford had made it absolutely clear that any deviation from the plan would result in immediate disciplinary action. The soldiers would arrive in full ceremonial dress uniform, red, tunics with gleaming brass buttons, dark blue trousers with red stripes, white belt and gloves, and the iconic black bearskin hats. They would march in formation from the barracks to the pub, maintaining perfect military bearing throughout the journey. Once they arrived at the Bell and Crown, they would enter in small groups and simply order drinks, behaving with the same dignity and professionalism they displayed at Buckingham Palace. James Mitchell stood among his brothers in arms, still somewhat overwhelmed by the response his humiliation had generated. He had never expected such a massive show of support, and part of him worried that the situation was escalating beyond what the original incident warranted. But Crawford had explained to him that this wasn't about revenge or intimidation. It was about maintaining the respect and dignity that allowed the guards to perform their ceremonial duties effectively. At precisely 11 o'clock, the formation began its march through the streets of London. The sight of 43 guardsmen in full dress uniform, moving in perfect synchronization, was extraordinary even by London standards. Tourists stopped to take photographs, office workers pressed against windows to watch, and traffic slowed as drivers tried to figure out what special ceremony was taking place. The rhythmic sound of their boots on the pavement created a drumbeat that seemed to announce their approach long before they became visible. Children pointed from school windows. Elderly residents came out of their homes to watch, and shopkeepers stepped onto the sidewalk to witness the unprecedented procession. Marcus Thompson heard them coming before he saw them. The steady beat of military boots on stone was unmistakable, and it grew louder with each passing second. He stood behind the bar of the Bell and Crown, his hands gripping the polished wood as he tried to steady his nerves. The handful of customers who had arrived for early lunch stopped their conversations and turned toward the windows, sensing that something significant was about to happen. The first guardsman appeared at the corner, his red tunic brilliant in the morning sunlight and his bare skin adding nearly a foot to his already impressive height. Then came another, and another, until the entire street seemed filled with the magnificent sight of the Queen's Guard in full ceremonial regalia. Marcus felt his mouth go dry as he realized the true scale of what was approaching his pub. This wasn't a small group of angry soldiers looking for trouble. This was a full military demonstration, executed with the precision and dignity that had made the Guards famous around the world. The formation came to a halt outside the bell, and Crown and Crawford stepped forward to address his men one final time. His voice was quiet but carried clearly in the morning air as he reminded them of their purpose and their standards. They were there to demonstrate unity, support their fellow Guardsmen, and show that the uniform they wore deserved respect from all civilians. Then, in groups of 4 and 5, the Guardsmen began entering the pub. Each group maintained perfect military bearing as they walked through the door, removed their bearskin hats with synchronized precision, and approached the bar. Their movements were so coordinated they might have been performing a ceremonial drill at the palace. Marcus found himself serving drink after drink to men who treated him with absolute politeness and professionalism. Each Guardsman ordered clearly, paid promptly, and thanked him courteously. There were no threats, no angry words, and no hostile behavior. But the sheer presence of so many uniformed soldiers in his small pub created an atmosphere unlike anything he had ever experienced. The regular customers who had been in the pub when the Guardsmen arrived sat in stunned silence, nursing their pints and watching history unfold around them. Some were clearly uncomfortable with the military presence, while others seemed fascinated by the display of discipline and unity they were witnessing. James Mitchell was in the third group to enter the pub. When he walked through the door, Marcus immediately recognized him as the young soldier from Tuesday night. But instead of the defeated and humiliated young man who had left with his bearskin in his hands, Marcus now saw a Guardsman surrounded by his brothers, supported by his unit, and backed by centuries of military tradition. James approached the bar with the same quiet dignity he had displayed during his original visit. He ordered a pint of bitter, exactly as he had done before, and waited patiently while Marcus served him. When their eyes met, there was no anger or hostility in James's expression. Only the calm professionalism of a soldier who knew his worth was recognized and protected by his fellow Guardsmen. The pub, which normally held about 30 customers, comfortably, now contained over 40 Guardsmen plus the original patrons. But there was no pushing, no loud conversation, and no disorderly behavior. The soldiers stood quietly, drinking their beer and engaging in low, respectful conversation among themselves. Marcus realized that he was witnessing something extraordinary. This wasn't intimidation or harassment. It was a masterclass in military discipline and dignity. Every Guardsman in his pub was demonstrating exactly the kind of behavior that made the Queen's Guard respected around the world. Crawford was the last to enter, and his presence seemed to fill the remaining space in the pub completely. He was a man who had clearly seen combat, carried responsibility, and earned the respect of everyone under his command. When he approached the bar, Marcus felt the full weight of military authority and tradition bearing down on him. The sergeant major ordered a half pint of bitter and stood quietly while Marcus served him. Then, in a voice that carried just far enough to be heard by everyone in the pub, he made a simple statement that would be remembered long after the last Guardsman had left. He thanked Marcus for his hospitality and noted how much the Guards appreciated establishments that welcomed military personnel with respect and dignity. He mentioned that they would certainly recommend the Bell and Crown to their fellow soldiers as a place where the uniform was treated with appropriate honor. The words were carefully chosen and delivered without any trace of sarcasm or threat. But everyone in the pub understood the message perfectly. Marcus had a choice to make about what kind of establishment he wanted to run and what kind of reputation he wanted to have in the military community. The silence in the Bell and Crown was profound as Sergeant Major Crawford finished his carefully measured words. Marcus Thompson stood behind his bar, surrounded by 43 of Britain's finest soldiers, feeling the weight of their collective gaze and the magnitude of his mistake. The polished brass buttons and pristine red tunics that filled his pub represented not just individual Guardsmen, but centuries of military tradition, honor, and service. For several long moments, nobody moved. The regular customers sat frozen at their tables, unsure whether they were witnessing a peaceful demonstration or the calm before a storm. The Guardsmen maintained their perfect military posture, their discipline evident in every straight back, and steady gaze. And Marcus found himself confronting a truth he had been avoiding since Tuesday night. He had been wrong. The young guardsman he had ejected hadn't been arrogant or demanding. James Mitchell had simply been a tired soldier looking for a quiet drink after a long day of serving his country. The authoritative tone that had triggered Marcus's anger was the same voice James used to maintain order among unruly tourists at Buckingham Palace, not an attempt to intimidate or dominate anyone in the pub. Marcus looked across the crowded room and found James standing among his fellow soldiers. The contrast between the humiliated young man from Tuesday night and the confident guardsman now supported by his unit was striking. James met his gaze steadily, without hostility, but also without submission. He was exactly what he appeared to, a professional soldier doing his job and deserving of basic respect. The realization hit Marcus like a physical blow. He had let his personal grief and unresolved anger about his brother's death cloud his judgment. He had taken out his frustration with war, loss, and authority on a young man who had nothing to do with any of those things. James Mitchell was probably younger than Danny had been when he died in Afghanistan, just another young man serving his country and trying to make it through each day. Crawford watched Marcus carefully, his experienced eyes recognizing the internal struggle playing out on the pub owner's face. The sergeant major had seen this kind of moment before, the instant when someone realized they had crossed a line and had to decide whether to retreat further into defensiveness or find the courage to make things right. The decision Marcus made in those crucial seconds would determine not just his relationship with the military community, but his own ability to live with himself going forward. He could dig in his heels, insist that he had been within his rights to eject anyone from his pub, and face the consequences of having alienated an entire segment of London society. Or he could find the strength to admit his mistake and try to repair the damage he had done. Marcus set down the glass he had been cleaning and stepped out from behind the bar. The movement caused a subtle shift in the room's energy, as everyone sensed that something significant was about to happen. He walked slowly across the pub floor, past tables full of his regular customers, and through the respectful formation of guardsmen, until he stood directly in front of James Mitchell. The young guardsman maintained his military bearing, but Marcus could see the uncertainty in his eyes. James had no idea what was coming next, whether he was about to face another humiliation or something entirely different. The silence stretched until it became almost unbearable, with the only sounds being the distant traffic from the street and the quiet ticking of the pub's old clock. Finally, Marcus found his voice. He spoke quietly, but in the hushed atmosphere his words carried clearly to every person in the room. He began with the hardest phrase in the English language, a genuine, unconditional apology. He told James that he had been wrong, that his actions Tuesday night had been inexcusable, and that the young guardsman had done nothing to deserve such treatment. But Marcus didn't stop there. He continued speaking, his voice growing stronger as he found the courage to be completely honest. He talked about his brother Danny, about the anger and grief he had carried for 8 years, and about how those unresolved emotions had poisoned his reaction to seeing James in uniform. He explained that his behavior had nothing to do with James personally, and everything to do with his own inability to process his loss appropriately. The confession was raw, honest, and deeply personal. Marcus was revealing his deepest pain to a room full of strangers, exposing the wounds that had never properly healed. Some of his regular customers shifted uncomfortably, unused to seeing their normally composed pub owner in such a vulnerable state. But the guardsmen listened with the respectful attention they would give to any soldier sharing his struggles. James accepted the apology with the same quiet dignity he had shown throughout the entire ordeal. He extended his hand to Marcus, and the two men shook hands in front of the assembled crowd. It was a simple gesture, but it carried enormous symbolic weight. The handshake represented forgiveness, understanding, and the possibility of healing old wounds. Crawford stepped forward and placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder. The sergeant major's approval was evident in his expression as he thanked the pub owner for his honesty and courage. Crawford had seen too many conflicts escalate because pride prevented people from admitting their mistakes, and he respected anyone who could find the strength to make things right. The atmosphere in the pub began to shift dramatically. The tension that had filled the room gradually gave way to something warmer and more positive. Conversations resumed, though they remained respectful and subdued. Some of the guardsmen began engaging with the regular customers, sharing stories, and finding common ground despite their different backgrounds. Marcus returned to his position behind the bar, but everything had changed. Instead of serving drinks with grudging efficiency, he found himself genuinely interested in talking with the guardsmen about their experiences, their training, and their service. He learned about the rigorous selection process for the Queen's Guard, the physical demands of standing motionless for hours in all weather conditions, and the pride these men took in their ceremonial duties. Mrs. Henderson, who had been sitting quietly in her corner booth throughout the entire encounter, approached the bar with tears in her eyes. She thanked Marcus for his apology and told him that she would continue to be a regular customer. Her forgiveness meant more to him than she probably realized, representing as it did the approval of someone who understood military service from a family perspective. As the afternoon wore on, something remarkable happened. Instead of drinking their beer quickly and leaving, many of the guardsmen lingered in the pub. They seemed genuinely to enjoy the atmosphere and the opportunity to interact with civilians in a relaxed, friendly environment. Several mentioned that they would likely return in the future, bringing friends and fellow soldiers with them. Marcus realized that his mistake, painful as it had been, might actually lead to something positive. The Bell and Crown could become a place where military personnel felt welcomed and respected, where the uniform was treated with appropriate honor rather than suspicion or resentment. It wouldn't bring his brother back or erase the pain of losing him, but it could be a way of honoring Danny's memory while supporting the young men and women who continued to serve. 6 months later, the Bell and Crown pub had transformed into something Marcus Thompson had never imagined possible. On any given evening, the Victorian establishment buzzed with a unique energy that came from the mixing of worlds that had previously seemed incompatible. Military personnel in various stages of uniform mingled freely with longtime local residents, university students, office workers, and tourists who had discovered the pub's growing reputation. The changes had been gradual but profound. Word of Marcus's public apology and the subsequent reconciliation had spread throughout London's military community, creating a ripple effect that extended far beyond the Guards division. Soldiers from different regiments, naval personnel on shore leave, and RAF aircrew began visiting the Bell and Crown, drawn by stories of a pub owner who had shown genuine remorse and created a welcoming environment for military families. Marcus had made deliberate changes to honor this new identity. A corner of the pub now displayed a carefully curated collection of military memorabilia, including photographs of local regiments, historical artifacts donated by veterans' families, and a memorial board listing neighborhood residents who had died in service to their country. Danny Thompson's name held a place of honor on that board, finally allowing Marcus to process his grief in a healthy, constructive way. The most significant change, however, was in Marcus himself. The anger and resentment that had poisoned his interactions for years had gradually given way to genuine curiosity about the military experience. He spent countless hours listening to stories from soldiers, learning about their training, their deployments, their fears, and their pride in serving something larger than themselves. James Mitchell had become a regular fixture at the Bell and Crown, often stopping by after his shifts at Buckingham Palace. The young guardsman had developed an easy friendship with Marcus, built on mutual respect and shared understanding of how quickly situations can escalate when people make assumptions about each other. James often brought fellow soldiers with him, introducing them to Marcus and ensuring they understood the pub's unique history. The relationship between James and Marcus had evolved into something neither man had expected. Marcus found himself becoming a mentor figure, someone James could talk to about the challenges of military life and the difficulty of maintaining dignity in the face of public scrutiny. In return, James helped Marcus understand the modern military experience, bridging the gap between the bitter memories of his brother's death and the reality of contemporary service members. Sergeant Major Crawford had also become an occasional visitor, typically appearing on Friday evenings when his duties permitted. His presence lent an air of official approval to the pub's military-friendly atmosphere, and his conversations with Marcus had helped the pub owner understand the broader context of military service in British society. Crawford appreciated finding a civilian establishment where his soldiers could relax without facing hostility or misunderstanding. The impact extended beyond just military personnel. Mrs. Henderson had become something of an unofficial historian for the pub, sharing stories about the neighborhood during wartime and helping younger customers understand the sacrifices previous generations had made. Her corner booth had evolved into an informal gathering place where different generations could connect over shared respect for service and sacrifice. The university students who had been harassing James on that fateful Tuesday night had also returned to the pub, though their behavior had changed dramatically. The incident had forced them to confront their own prejudices and assumptions about military service. Several had engaged in lengthy conversations with soldiers, learning about the realities of military life and developing new appreciation for the challenges these young men and women faced. Local media had eventually picked up the story, though Marcus had been careful to keep the focus on reconciliation rather than the original conflict. A feature article in the local newspaper highlighted how the Bell and Crown had become a bridge between civilian and military communities, demonstrating that understanding could emerge from even the most difficult situations. The economic impact had been substantial as well. The pub's revenue had increased by nearly 40% as word spread about its unique atmosphere and welcoming approach to military personnel. But for Marcus, the financial success was secondary to the personal healing that had taken place. On quiet Sunday afternoons, Marcus often found himself reflecting on the journey from that terrible Tuesday night to the thriving establishment he now operated. The pub had always been his legacy, but now it represented something much more meaningful than just a family business. It had become a testament to the possibility of growth, forgiveness, and positive change. The most profound moment came on a rainy Thursday evening in March, exactly 1 year after the guardsman's visit. James Mitchell walked into the pub carrying a carefully wrapped package, followed by Sergeant Major Crawford and a small group of senior guardsmen. The package contained a framed photograph of the original 43 guardsmen who had participated in the visit, signed by each man with a simple inscription, "To Marcus Thompson, with respect and appreciation for your courage and character, the photograph now hangs prominently behind the bar, serving as a daily reminder of how quickly situations can change when people choose understanding over anger, apology over pride, and bridge building over division. Customers often ask about the story behind the picture, giving Marcus countless opportunities to share the lessons he learned about assumptions, grief, healing, and the power of genuine remorse. As Marcus looked around his transformed pub that evening, watching guardsmen in dress uniform sharing tables with elderly residents, young professionals, and curious tourists, he finally understood what his brother Danny would have wanted. Not anger, resentment, or withdrawal from the world, but engagement, understanding, and the recognition that service comes in many forms, including the simple act of creating spaces where different people can come together in mutual respect. The mere Bell and Crown had become more than just a pub. It was proof that even the most painful mistakes could lead to something beautiful, if people had the courage to admit when they were wrong and the wisdom to learn from their failures. And in a world that often seemed divided by misunderstanding and mistrust, that was perhaps the most valuable service of all.